This video is on the third class of organic compounds called lipids. Now, what distinguishes lipids from the other classes of organic compounds I've talked about so far, that being carbohydrates and proteins, the biggest unique characteristic for lipids is that they are non-polar. They therefore do not dissolve in water. They have a lot of carbon and hydrogen bonds because carbon hydrogen bonds store lots of energy, and that is the function of lipids. They function in energy storage.
As we mentioned in the introduction to carbohydrates, the periodic table hides some useful secrets. This column headed by helium has no great urge to make bonds with other atoms. The column to its left wants to make one bond. The second column to its left wants to make two bonds. Third column atoms want to make three bonds, and so on. Remembering this information, let's make a fatty acid molecule. This carbon atom wants to make four bonds. So let's give it a double bond with oxygen. And let's give it a single bond to an OH molecule. That's a total of 3 bonds for the carbon. It still wants another. So let's give it another carbon for its fourth bond. But now we have the need for 3 more bonds for the new carbon. Let's give it 2 hydrogens and another carbon. Now this new carbon needs 3 more bonds. So we give it 2 hydrogens and another carbon. We can keep going, making a chain of carbons, with each carbon having 2 side bonds to hydrogen. But let's end it by adding 3 hydrogen atoms, like this. This molecule is a molecule of butyric acid. It is the shortest chain fatty acid, containing only 4 carbon atoms. Here is another fatty acid. It is a molecule of stearic acid. It contains 18 carbon atoms. Notice that all the middle carbons in the chain contain bonds to 2 hydrogen atoms. This configuration contains the maximum number of hydrogen atoms possible. So this molecule is termed saturated, as in saturated fat. An alternate possibility for an 18-carbon fatty acid is this one. It is a molecule of oleic acid. And notice there is a double bond between carbons 9 and 10. So each of those carbons have only one bond available for the side hydrogen. Since there's a possibility to add hydrogens to this configuration, we say that it is unsaturated. Since there is only one carbon double bond, we say that it is monounsaturated. If there were 2 or more, we would say that it is polyunsaturated. Also notice that the carbon double bond causes a kink in the carbon chain. All naturally occurring fatty acids with a double bond have a kink in their shape at the location of the double bond. But it is possible to manufacture fatty acids that are transformed in shape to do away with that kink. These trans fats are more stable, so food manufacturers prefer them. But without the kink, they physically pack together easily and tend to clog arteries as a result. Adding hydrogen to replace carbon double bonds is called hydrogenation. Now let's build a fat molecule from these fatty acid building blocks. We begin with a molecule of glycerol, which will form the backbone of the molecule and hold the fatty acids in place. These hydrogen atoms in the glycerol then combine with OH molecules at the end of the fatty acid chains to form 3 molecules of water, while the rest of the fatty acid chains join to the now exposed oxygen atoms. 3 fatty acids join nitroglycerin, form a molecule of triglycerides. Although triglycerides can become hazardous to your health if the level of them in your bloodstream gets unnaturally high, they play an important role in metabolism as energy sources and transporters of dietary fat.
Okay, so that was a whole lot of information in a few short minutes, but I'm going to go through all of that. So, one of the basic building blocks for a lipid, remember, we've been talking about these polymers or these macromolecules and looking at how they're broken down into their most basic structure. The fatty acid is one of the most basic structures of a lipid. It is an unbranched carbon chain with a carboxyl group at one end. And you can see the carboxyl group here, remembering that the OH in the corners make this end of the fatty acid polar. The other end of it is just hydrocarbon, which is nonpolar. So fatty acids make up most lipids. Like I said, the different ends of a fatty acid molecule have different properties. So the carboxyl end is polar because of the OH in the upper right-hand corner, which you see there, which means the carboxyl end is hydrophilic or water-loving. The other end is just a hydrocarbon, which means it's nonpolar, which means it's also hydrophobic or water-fearing. So you have two different ends of a fatty acid. One of them can dissolve in water and one of them cannot. So one of the things he talked about in the video was whether or not there are any double bonds in a fatty acid. So I want to go back and talk about that again. So here we have what's called a saturated fatty acid. Now the word saturated, just as a regular English vocabulary word, saturated means to be full or like you can't hold anymore. If you go out and you stand in the middle of a rainstorm, you become saturated with water. You become really full with water or soaked. So in a saturated fatty acid, all of the carbon atoms are bonded to four individual atoms. They're all single bonds there. So the carbon atoms we call saturated. They cannot bond anymore. They are at their full bonding potential. And saturated fatty acids form long, straight chains. This is really important. Long, straight chains. Unsaturated fatty acids are going to contain double bonds, which means that certain carbons that are participating in the double bonds are not bonded to their full potential of four atoms. So carbon atoms have double bonds, and these are going to be bent chains. They are not straight. And that's going to have an effect when we talk about the different classes of lipids. There's four different types of lipids. So lipids are grouped according to their structure, keeping in mind that all four of these are going to be still lipids, which means they're nonpolar. There are three classes of lipids that are important to living things and that contain fatty acids. These are triglycerides, phospholipids, and waxes. So I'm going to go through each of these separately, and then I'll talk about the fourth class of lipid, which is also important to living things, but does not contain fatty acids. So three of the lipids contain fatty acids and one does not. So I'm going to start with triglycerides. This is what we would consider typically our fats and oils. Now, the reason why they call it triglyceride is because we have a glycerol molecule on the side and three fatty acids attached to it. So tri-3-glyceride, meaning the glycerol. Now, remembering what I said about the saturated versus unsaturated fatty acids, if you have, and I'm just going to draw like a skeletal diagram here, if you have saturated triglycerides, that means here's your glycerol backbone, and here's 1, 2, 3 saturated fatty acids. They are straight chains, which means you can line up all of your saturated fatty acids. I'm doing a horrible job at drawing, and you'll get to know very well that I do not draw at all. But because they're all in long straight chains, you can line them up and compact them really close together. So these are going to be solid at room temperature. These are generally what we call the animal fats, like butter. Even bacon, The white part of the bacon is the fat. It is solid at room temperature because they are saturated fats, saturated fatty acids, that they're all straight. So you can put all of these triglycerides right next to each other in a nice, neat row and pack them in really close together. If you have unsaturated fats, they're liquid at room temperature. So why would that be? Well, going back to the unsaturated fatty acids that have a bent chain. So here's my glycerol backbone, but here's a chain that bends. Here's a chain that bends, and here's a chain that bends. So you can't pack them as close together because guess what? I need room for my next bent chain. Maybe it bends that way. So you can't pack as many close together because of the double bonds that make the fatty acid kink or bend in different directions. So these are liquid at room temperature. Really easy way to think about this is if they were particles. So if particles are lined up in nice neat rows close together, that's a solid. If particles are further apart, that's a liquid. And so we call these are plant fats mostly, and we call them oils. You have the omega-3 and omega-6. You've got medium chain triglycerides, and you've got mono unsaturated. Remember, if it's mono unsaturated, that means that there's only one double bond. But if you have double bonds in there, it becomes an unsaturated triglyceride, which means that it's liquid at room temperature, like your oils. Okay, that's triglycerides. The second class of lipid is called phospholipid. This is, you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, we still have our glycerol as a backbone, but now we have our two fatty acids, and the third fatty acid has been replaced with a phosphate group. That's why it's called a phospholipid. Now, the main function that phospholipids play is in the composition of the cell membrane. And this is where having the two different ends of the fatty acid has a really important function. Remember that one end of the fatty acid is hydrophilic, which means it likes water. One end of the fatty acid is hydrophobic, which means it hates water. And so when it comes to the cell membrane, we often condense this structure into what you see here, which is a head and two tails. Now, these tails here represent the hydrophobic end of the fatty acid, and the part of the head represents the hydrophilic end. So this is the cell membrane. Now, what is the majority of the environment on the outside and the inside of the cell is water, right? We're made mostly of water. So you have to have what's called a bi-layer. You have to have two layers of phospholipids because you can't just have your hydrophobic tails exposed to water because they don't mix. But if you have another layer of phospholipids and you have your tails, your hydrophobic tails are protected in the interior of that membrane, then everything's fine. Whoops. Wait. Right. So like I said, the cell membrane is what's called a lipid bilayer. It's two layers because you've got the hydrophobic tails, which are those hydrocarbon ends of the fatty acids that are protected in the interior of the cell wall, while the hydrophilic heads, which is the carboxyl end, the glycerol and the carboxyl end of the fatty acid, that's hydrophilic because extracellular, meaning outside the cell, and the cytoplasm, which is inside the cell, are both very watery environments. So you have to protect those hydrophobic tails. Because the tails are hydrophobic, this allows the cell membrane to be a barrier between the outside of the cell and the inside of the cell.
Likewise, the fatty acids that make up your cell membranes have polar heads, which keeps them interacting with the aqueous environment of our bodies, but non-polar tails, which prevent the cells from just being dissolved by the water around them. Pretty dang elegant, if you ask me. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so it just makes a barrier because water can't get past those hydrophobic tails. So you're basically keeping the water both to the outside and to the inside of the cell because of those hydrophobic tails. Okay, the third type of lipid that contains fatty acid is a wax. It's called a structural lipid. It is composed of a long fatty acid chain joined to an alcohol chain. And the biggest unique property of a wax is that it is highly waterproof. Now, it has two different functions depending on if you're plants or animals. You can see from the picture in the top right corner, plants are covered with a waxy substance, and that protects the outer surface from losing water. It's also why water beads up into a spherical shape, because a sphere has the least amount of surface area to volume ratio, which means because water is polar and wax, which covers the leaves, is nonpolar, then you have the least amount of the polar water touching the nonpolar wax. An example of where wax is used in animals is an earwax, and that basically just prevents dirt and bacteria from getting into the ear and causing infection. All right, now the fourth class of lipid is still nonpolar, but it does not contain fatty acids at all. It is four fused carbon rings with functional groups attached to them. A lot of our hormones are steroids. You can see here we've got cholesterol, estrogen, and testosterone is the one down here. A lot of our hormones are actually cholesterol based. So our body uses cholesterol and then converts or adds functional groups to it to create the other hormones.
Cause of lipids is the steroids. Steroids have a backbone of four interconnected carbon rings, which can be used to form hundreds of variations. The most fundamental of them is cholesterol, which binds with phospholipids to help form cell walls. But these can also be activated to turn into different lipid hormones. And so now